The Russian Civil War is generally remembered as a minor conflict fought between two factions, the Bolshevik Reds and the Imperialist Whites, between 1917 and 1923. Simple enough, right? Wrong. The Russian Civil War was one of the most convoluted conflicts the world has ever seen. Fighting both the Red and White armies were an assortment of other factions, including anarchists and over 20 different units from around the world. While the Japanese tried to colonize part of Siberia, a lost Czechoslovak army won a naval battle on the world's deepest lake and, amongst all this, $51 million worth of gold simply vanished. In this video, we shed light on 6 crazy stories from this tumultuous conflict. The city of Tsaritsyn, later renamed Stalingrad, was a strategic fulcrum during the Russian Civil War. Straddling the Sarita River, the city controlled access to southeastern Russia. A young Bolshevik officer named Stalin captured it in 1918, but by June 1919, his position was precarious. General Rangil, commander-in-chief of imperial forces in South Russia, had made it his mission to take the city back from the Reds. The British decided to assist him and sent in Major Bruce of the Royal Tank Corps with 6 Mark V tanks. Bruce's job was strictly limited to training the Russians in armored warfare, not to do any fighting himself. But this he ignored. General Rangil had launched infantry assaults on the fortified city twice, but had failed to take it. For his third and final push, he needed some extra firepower. He personally requested Bruce and his British tank crew lead the next attack. On June 28th, Bruce's tank smashed through the barbed wire and trenches of the city's outer defenses. Unable to penetrate the vehicle's armor with their rifles, the Bolshevik defenders broke and ran. This brought Rangil time to refuel the tanks, as the gas guzzlers had already run out. But his men physically couldn't carry enough fuel for all the tanks, so they only brought enough for one, Major Bruce's. Once refueled, the tank clattered through the remaining defenses and into Tsaritsyn. The vehicle had quite literally saved the day. Bruce was showered with accolades, and the engagement was described as one of the most remarkable feats in the whole history of the Tank Corps. Of all the strange bedfellows that joined the fight against the Bolsheviks, perhaps none were further from home than the Australians. Aussies served in training units in Russia's southern regions and Siberia, but their main deployment was in the Arctic North. Around 150 men were deployed to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk to protect White Russian supplies and maintain an extraction point if their allies were defeated. But these volunteers weren't just pulling guard duty. They battled the enemy so fiercely, they became the Commonwealth contingent's most decorated soldiers. 22-year-old Sergeant Pierce, a decorated veteran of Gallipoli and the Western Front, fought in the attack on Yemtsa, south of Arkhangelsk. When his platoon came under fire from an enemy blockhouse, Pierce acted fast. He cut his way through a tangle of barbed wire towards the position while exposed to intense machine gun and rifle fire. He then charged and killed the blockhouse's defenders. When Pierce emerged from the blockhouse, he was hit by a burst of machine gun fire and mortally wounded. Days later, he died. Brave Aussie was posthumously awarded the 2nd Victoria Cross of the campaign. A section of the citation reads, "His magnificent bravery and utter disregard for personal danger won him the admiration of all troops." The emergence of large-scale anarchist societies has been exceptionally rare in modern times, but every once in a while, in perfect conditions, one appears. This happened in Ukraine in 1918, when the anarchist region of Makhnovshchina broke away. As a brief overview, Makhnovshchina was a largely agricultural region populated by 7 to 8 million peasants. It had no state institutions, and its highest level of organization were its local councils. It did have a disciplined and well-armed military though, known as the Black Army. Makhnovshchina's location in Europe's breadbasket made it a valuable prize. First came the Whites, who after a string of early victories looked like they might take Moscow. The Black Army attacked their rear and decisively defeated the Whites in the Battle of Peregonovka. They pushed on, seizing all of southern Ukraine. Unable to defeat the anarchists, the Whites fled to Constantinople. As soon as they had, the Reds, which had maintained an uneasy alliance with the Blacks, turned traitor. Under the guise of a joint planning conference, the Bolsheviks kidnapped and executed the Black Army's commanders. Simultaneously, 350,000 Red Army soldiers, equipped with aircraft and armored trains, advanced into Ukraine. The 10,000-strong Black Army fought back tenaciously, but couldn't match the Red numbers. The last remnants were destroyed 2 years later, in 1922. Landlocked Czechoslovakia had a 100% win rate in naval battles. This was due to the Czechoslovak Legion's victory in the Battle of Lake Baikal during the Russian Civil War. The Czechoslovak state didn't exist in 1918, and the territory it would later govern was controlled by Austro-Hungary. But, in the heart of Siberia, a Czechoslovak army raised in Russia to fight the Central Powers had had enough of World War I and decided to battle their way home through the entirety of Russia. During their trek east, the Czechoslovaks captured several ports on the shores of Lake Baikal, the world's deepest lake. They also captured 2 Soviet steamers, Sibirak and Fedosia. The commander, General Garda, ordered 2 howitzers mounted to each ship and had the Czechoslovak artillerymen hastily trained as naval gunners. In August 16th, this impromptu fleet steamed over the lake toward its target, the Soviet-held city of Babushkin. The Czechoslovaks advanced to within 4 kilometers, then opened fire on the city. They sank the enemy ship Baikal and demolished the railway station, scattering Soviet troops. In the preceding months, the Czechs battled their way to Vladivostok, where they were picked up by the French and eventually transported home to Czechoslovakia, a country none of them had ever seen. Russia and Japan had long held overlapping imperial ambitions in Asia, and as Russia dissolved into civil war in 1917, Japanese planners seized the opportunity to assert their claims once and for all. An international force allied with White Russia was deployed to Vladivostok in mid to late 1918, mirroring the deployments in southern Russia and the Arctic. Initially, Japanese politicians agreed to send a contingent of 12,000 troops, but when this reached the ears of the Imperial Army, the generals decided to deploy 70,000. The government ministers weren't happy, but since they preferred not to be assassinated, they didn't protest too much. Accompanying the soldiers were 50,000 Japanese settlers, who opened Japanese banks and set up Japanese industry in a territory that was, by mid-1918, fast becoming a Japanese protectorate. They named it Transbaikal, and it was nominally run by Cossack warlord Ataman Semyonov. In Tokyo, it was hoped the Transbaikal buffer state would permit permanent Japanese access to rich Siberian mineral deposits and provide a strategic foothold in Russia. By July 1920, it became clear the Reds would win the war. Transbaikal couldn't hope to hold out against a full invasion, and the Japanese didn't want to commit to large-scale conflict just yet, so they abandoned it. The settlers and soldiers left, leaving Semyonov to deal with the Soviets alone. He fled to Manchuria, but was captured by Soviet paratroopers in 1945. A year later, he was executed. Just before World War I, the Russian Imperial Gold Reserve was the richest on the planet. Literal tons of gold flowed from Siberian mines and profitable Asian trade networks into the treasuries of Russia's rulers. Much of this gold was offshored during the war as collateral for foreign loans and to purchase arms. But much remained in Russia, loaded on Admiral Kolchak's so-called gold train. Kolchak saw himself as Russia's next Tsar, and he backed up this claim with an enormous stash of gold. Before the Bolsheviks had forced him from Moscow, Kolchak made off with around 30% of the imperial gold reserve loaded on his gold train. He was eventually surrendered to the Soviets, along with most of his gold, by the Czechoslovak Legion in return for safe passage. That left a shortfall of 8,885,000 gold rubles, roughly 51 million US dollars today, which seemingly disappeared. Recent historical research has discovered that most of this missing gold was probably stolen by the Japanese. Their strong security presence in the Far East made them ideal candidates to protect the gold while the White Russians got on with their war. When the Soviets won, the Japanese quietly shipped the gold home. Significant amounts of gold left in Japanese banks as collateral for weapons never delivered was also appropriated. When White Russian emigres tried to get it back, the Japanese told them they could only give it back to the Imperial Russian state, which had dissolved, essentially declaring finders keepers. Additionally, it's largely unclear whether the majority of the gold shipped out of Russia in the Tsar's and White Russia's last days was actually used as loan collateral, or if only a small portion was. If this is true, it's possible that the US, Britain, France, and Japan collectively defrauded Imperial Russia of the modern equivalent of 2 billion US dollars in gold. Those were 6 crazy and largely unknown stories from one of modern history's most tumultuous conflicts, the Russian Civil War. But what do you think? Did you know that Stalin fought British tanks in the city that would later bear his name? How do you think anarchists managed to organize an army? Where do you think the Tsar's gold went? Let us know in the comments.